Go for like 5 or 10 minutes.
Hi, how are you? This is Valerie Velazquez-Stetz, and I am here live with my friend Larry Cosme. He's the president of the Law Enforcement Association, Federal Officers Law Enforcement Association, and has lots of knowledge. And if you know, he's been on Fox News for several times this week, last week, and he was talking about police reform with President Donald Trump. So we want to just discuss several issues with him, what's going on today in law enforcement, and do an average civilian, do they want to become law enforcement officers at this point? So, hi Larry, how are you?
Hey Val, thanks for having me here.
So, what do you think about today's society with the riots, if you want to call it riots, or if you want to call it protests, New York City, Atlantic City, the big cities, Jersey City, and the cops actually kneeling?
I think it's, peaceful protesting is welcome in the United States, and that's a constitutional right we as Americans have, and we're okay with that. I mean, what we're not okay with is the rioters and the looters that are destroying businesses, attacking the men and women in blue, and throwing bricks, throwing caustic substances, and throwing urine at the officers that are serving and protecting our country. And that's not acceptable, and that's something that we're going to tolerate in this society.
But so how do they differentiate between a protest and a riot? So when they first start out, they say it's a simple protest, when they get permits to go to certain streets in certain towns, and then it actually turns into a riot. So how are you prepared for that, and how are the officers prepared for that?
Well, that's the tough part, because sometimes what happens, peaceful protesters are hijacking these peaceful protests, and then you have the individuals that are planning these attacks against the officers, and they're pushing forth this false narrative and trying to vilify and demonize the officers that are doing their job day in and day out, as professionals. Right. So it's a tough job trying to differentiate who is there peacefully or who is trying to hurt these officers or trying to destroy locations where they're actually conducting peaceful protests.
Right. So obviously they want it to be peaceful. Like, who doesn't want a peaceful protest, correct? So a law enforcement officer does not go to work, looking for, to be shot at, to getting to a confrontation. Just want to go to work and do your job and go home safely. So when you go to a protest and you see officers on their knee and something breaks out, how could they respond to that once they're on their knee? Now you're in a submissive state.
I'm not going to characterize what each individual officer does. It's a determination that he or she needs to decide, what they want to do of their own free will.
Right.
And if they want to do something like that, that's up to them. I personally don't advocate that someone should be kneeling when you're in a situation where you potentially could be attacked by a non-peaceful protester, because obviously some of these organizations are organizing this, not the peaceful ones, but the ones that are advocating, anarchy in our country and looting and rioting and trying to do damage to businesses, and that's totally unacceptable in this country, and it's something that we should be careful for and making sure that we protect those communities that they serve.
Absolutely. I know for myself, being retired, when I watch the news daily and, read whatever I read through social media, and I'm very upset. So my stomach's in a knot, my heart hurts, and I feel so much pain for these officers that are being hit, injured, cursed at, spat at, so many different things. Like, they're people. Like, so how do they deal with that? Like, I can't even understand like what they're going through. So what is your perspective on that? Like, how do you feel? What do you think they're going through? Like, and how could they overcome, what they're going through?
I think it's totally despicable that officers are being treated that way, because the majority of all the officers are really good human beings. There are human beings behind those badges. They are family members. They are mothers. They are fathers. They are children. They're cousins. They're aunts. They're uncles. They are good, genuinely good people. And they went into the law enforcement profession because it's a noble profession. And they're trying to characterize some officers just because one individual or a couple of individuals have done things that they shouldn't have. But that's not fair. It's sort of like, judging other people in other professions because they do something incorrectly and you want to group them all together. You should not do that because I think it sends a wrong message. But I know that the majority of Americans care about the law enforcement officers in their communities, both state, local, and federal. I know they do because I'm out there. I do talk to the citizens that are non-law enforcement officials, and they do care. They are going to speak up, and they are speaking up, in our country. And it's important that they do go out and say things about our country that is important for the law enforcement officers to hear. And they need to speak up because they are the majority. And that's important that they speak up and say that they are supportive of the law enforcement officers in their community and what they're doing day in and day out.
That's correct. And I know so many people that are actually on our side. They know, hey, listen, one bad apple, that does not define all of us,
That's correct.
And why should we all be mistreated? So if you're a doctor and you make a mistake, because, people are human, should every doctor be, we throw rocks at every doctor we see and spit on and kill, actually, because so many officers have died through these riots and protests. So, what could we do, as Americans to help them, overcome these? And how do you think their wives feel? Like, oh my God, when they see their husband or wife, vice versa, go out to work and they have to worry, are they coming back? And how do you think those children feel? Like, oh my gosh, is daddy going to get killed today? Is mommy going to get killed today? What about them?
And that's important. What about their families? And let's talk about the officers that have been killed since these riots have started. The mainstream media does not want to talk about that. We've had a lot of officers killed in the line of duty and attacked, and that's an important thing that we need to highlight, throughout our country. It's totally unacceptable that is happening. It's already a profession that's dangerous, and families worry whether it's a spouse or a partner to one of these officers. They should not be worrying at home. They already worry, before all these things started. Now there are planned attacks against these officers, and that's totally unacceptable. This country should not be putting up with that, and the majority of Americans need to speak up, and we are going to continue to speak up as an association to defend this noble profession, and that's important that we send that message across the U.S.
Absolutely, because right now it's getting out of hand, but I know you could have a peaceful protest, but at any time it could turn violent, okay? Because I've seen it in smaller towns where they thought everything was great, and then at the end of the night, once, gets dark, rocks start flying, heads get busted, and all different things happen. So, really what I want to know is what we could do, what could Americans do to try to help these officers feel like, we care about them. We want them. We do not want to defund them. We actually want more. I want to go home and feel safe. And if something happens, I want to call a police officer. I want to call the police department and expect the police officer within 10 minutes. So if you defund them, that's not going to happen. So I don't even know how this makes sense. And especially if you live in a city. Guess what? Stuff happens all the time. Your house gets broken into, your cars get broken into, you're sick, you could have a heart attack, your parents could have a heart attack, whatever, any type of illness. You could be getting followed, domestic violence is rampant. And, what would you do in that case without officers? It's totally insane that people think that they do not need police officers. And who is supposed to protect you? The guys in the street that are dealing drugs? good luck with that. So what do you think?
I think this false narrative is totally ridiculous. The defunding of the police departments, it's totally a bad message to send to our country. Defunding is a when I hear that, I kind of chuckle a little bit, because that narrative that folks are pushing out there is really a bad narrative. And politicians that have any wherewithal should be thinking about it and saying, wait a minute, this is not a good message to be sending out, because it sends the wrong message to the community about defunding the police departments. On the contrary, a lot of departments through attrition have been downsized, and what they need to do is actually reevaluate these departments and actually add more police officers to the communities that they serve. Because let's face it, folks, the first person that we call when we have an emergency at our household is 911. We call for that police officer, where he or she, we need you to show up at our doorstep. And we're thankful that we have these officers that are willing to serve in big cities in rural America, or just in any suburb. Those are the folks that protect you, that protect your children, that protect your families, and protect the cities that they serve. And this defund the police is a total nonsense, totally ridiculous. When I hear this, I say that's crazy. Let's look at the countries. Let's go outside the United States, the countries that don't have funded, police departments or have any type of laws on the books that are protecting the citizens of their community. It's rampant corruption. There's rampant lawlessness. If that's what we want in our country, go push that narrative to defund the police, because that's not good for the United States. That's all I got to say about that.
That's correct. You're so right, Larry. I listen to a lot of things you say, obviously. I'm a fan. So, the executive order by President Trump for reform, I know you were there, and that's awesome that you were there, number one. And what do you think is going to happen with that executive order? They're saying about the chokehold, they want to do away with that. But if you're in a life-threatening situation and that's all you could do is grab, you grab whatever you could grab, right, while they're fighting and struggling with you. You can't say, oh, wait, I can't grab your neck, let me grab your leg. You can't do that when you're in the middle of a fight. So how do you avoid something like that and to hold them? Because that actually holds them in place. But unfortunately, what happened in Minnesota, it happened, not Minnesota, yeah. So Minneapolis, right. So whatever he did, which was wrong, okay, it was wrong. We all know that. So why does everybody have to suffer for that, like right now? I really don't get it, like what's going on. And I get it, there's racism. We spoke about that. You being a Cuban American, born in Cuba, socialist country, and, dealing with racism, myself included, we all dealt with different within our own, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Ecuadorian, Colombian, it's funny, everybody has, some type, but we should try to do away with that. But is this the right way? And what is, if this is not?
I'm not sure why, folks. I in terms of policing in America, we were invited and we were provided a seat at the table by the White House, and we're appreciative that we had that opportunity. And I think the executive order is a step in the right direction. And we also had a seat at the table with Senator Scott from South Carolina, and we had the ability to weigh in because he wanted our feedback from the law enforcement professionals, and the associations that are working in this noble profession. And I think that's important to have a seat at the table. You want to collaborate with the folks that are policing your communities and are protecting your community, and that's important because you can see their perspective, and you want the perspective of the private citizen. That's important also. And as far as discrimination, there's no rampant discrimination in the law enforcement profession. And I'm sure there is, like any profession, there is discrimination, and we don't tolerate that. We want everyone to be treated equally across the board. Right. And that's what the profession, and any profession, everyone should be treated equally across the board. And it should be zero tolerance. Any law enforcement officer that witnesses discrimination in their profession, they should stop it and they should speak up and they should intervene. and that should never be happening in the law enforcement profession. But unfortunately, people are human beings, and they do things that they shouldn't, and those individuals should be dealt with immediately and accordingly, and other individuals should not be painted with a broad brush, because that's not fair. It's not fair like in any other profession that we've talked about. It's a noble profession, like I've said. A lot of people do a great job, and they make split-second decisions. It's a profession that sometimes you walk into a situation like you talked about earlier. It could be an armed robbery. It could be a break-in and entry in a home, or an alarm at a business, a commercial business. Or it could be an investigation that someone's conducting, and then they face these assailants that are trying to attack them with a weapon, whether it's a knife, a gun, or a brick, or a caustic substance, and then these officers have to deal with that. So they're making split-second decisions based on the circumstances that they're being dealt at the moment. So these are things that we need to support these officers for, and we need to make sure that they have the appropriate tools to do their job in this noble profession.
Speaking of noble profession, do you feel that will the average citizen want to become a police officer? Would you want to become a police officer today? And who are they going to get? The bottom of the barrel? People that scored like a 70, 75 on the test instead of the people that scored 92 and above? Like, that's the way it was back in the day. I mean, it was so many people wanted to become a law enforcement officer. They wanted to make a difference and help, and it was a great profession. Like you said, today I've seen so many people retiring where I know they would have never retired before. They love the job.
Yes.
And now it's so, the morale in the departments, it's really sad. So, who do you think we are going to get, to be police officers in our towns?
I mean, that's going to be a tough job, because right now we have a tough job at recruiting qualified law enforcement officers.
Right.
And with the way that the narrative is going across the country where they're attacking these officers, it's going to make it a whole lot difficult for the officers to, for the law enforcement community to recruit, because we have different levels of law enforcement. You have the local, state, and federal law enforcement community, and that will become very, very hard to do if we don't, the law-abiding citizens need to speak up and say enough is enough. We are not going to put up with this. We're okay with peaceful protesting. That's your constitutional right, and that's important. We understand that discrimination should not occur in law enforcement, and we're 100% behind that should not be occurring, in law enforcement. And the folks that are law-abiding need to support the law enforcement community 150% and send a message across the country.
Okay, that's great that you said that, but don't you think they are afraid? Because if they back the blue, they're going to be called racist, this, that, or they're not for Black Lives Matter or Antifa, and, they got to be down with Black Lives Matter, and people were putting that on their social media. It actually disgusts me. It makes me sick, like, looking at that. Like, are you serious? Do you need to put that out there? Like, and meanwhile, a lot of the people that did put it out, I know they're racist as it is, but who cares about that? Like, why is it all about Black Lives Matter? What about Cuban lives? Do you matter? What about Puerto Rican lives, Italian lives, Irish lives? We all matter. So, do we need to paint the streets with Black Lives Matter? Do we need to give a flag to the family of a criminal? Or that is supposed to be for our military that gave their lives for this country and for our freedom. What do you think about that?
I think as Americans, we have the ability to support any organization that you feel free that you should support. But I will clearly support organizations that are about protecting and serving our communities, and that's important. And you could speak up for whatever you believe in, but to vilify officers and joining an anarchist group, to attack and advocate violence against law enforcement, that should not be tolerated in this country, or in any country. Or if you're advocating attacking civilians. That should not be tolerated. The violence needs to stop against law enforcement officers, and the violence needs to stop against civilians. And the violence against, or the attacks against these businesses should stop, because that should be intolerable. And as far as if you want to join any group in this country, God bless you, go right ahead, because that's why we are Americans. You have that right. And we could advocate for Blue Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, whatever life you want to advocate for, that's important, or Hispanic Lives Matter. But at the end of the day, all lives matter. If you're a law-abiding citizen, all lives matter. And if you're trying to break the law and try to hurt folks, there are consequences to that. And that's what people need to realize. You need to be a law-abiding citizen. You need to obey the law. You need to follow lawful orders that a law enforcement officer gives you. And if you're in a scenario, and to start, putting everybody in the same group, that's wrong in terms of not every law enforcement officer is a racist. That is not true. So that message that people are trying to put out there, that is not true at all. So I am here to advocate for the law enforcement professional that he or she is willing to do right by the communities that they serve. And that's important, and we continue to send that message out.
That's correct. And we all are saddened by, Floyd's death. It was horrendous. And, we all feel bad for the family. But should you be like, should you have a gold casket and a horse and buggy and this whole insanity that went down? Like, if he was a national hero? Like, what happened to this country? Like, what happened? Like, are the good people bad and the bad people are good? That's not how I was raised. That's not what I was taught. So it was the opposite. And like you said, if you raise your children to respect all humans, and especially law enforcement, they tell you to do something, just do it. Follow your order and be on your way. It's so simple. But if you fight and try to take my gun, believe me, it's either you or me, and it's not going to be me. Right? So, and you don't want it to be you, because unfortunately, many officers are killed. And right now, they're actually hesitating to react and they're dead, because they're afraid, this is going to happen. They're going to be called racist. When you go to a call or go to any scene, right, as federal, state, local, they give you a call or a mission. They don't tell you the color of their skin, their nationality, none of that. You don't know. You just go to the call and you help and you do what you have to do. You do not say, oh, are they black? Are they white? Are they Asian? Are they Jewish? Are they Christian? No, you have to protect everyone. So to say that this officer's racist, that officer's racist, like, is that word just used to be used? Like, that's how I feel. How about you?
I think everyone's throwing that word around like it's sort of like a blanket statement. Right. Like I said earlier, and it should not be used that way, because not all folks are racist. That's not so. I did more than 33 and a half years in law enforcement, and I could tell you personally, I've never witnessed like a blanket situation like that. I had in a situation where I did witness something that was inappropriate, and I called out those individuals and I intervened in the situation. But it wasn't where it was like a use of force incident or anything, but it was in a conversation setting situation, and I stopped it from, and you need to speak up. If
Right.
you have certain beliefs about doing the right thing as a law enforcement officer, you're sworn to uphold the laws of this country. And as a law enforcement officer, when you take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, doesn't mean that you abdicate your rights as a law enforcement officer. So that Constitution's applicable for the officer too. They're entitled to due process, moving forward in terms of doing their job. And that's what folks want to take that due process right away from them. And that's not right. And that's something that we as a society need to support in terms of taking care of the officers that are doing right by the communities that they serve. Like I said earlier, it's a noble profession. It's not an easy job. It's a hard job. And that's where I want to tell the general public out there, if you want to know about what's going on with your community, maybe you should talk to the local police chief, the local sheriff, or your local state police folks, and see if you can do a ride-along. Some departments do ride-alongs. Look at the day, go in the day of the life of an officer. Look at their lives. Look at what they deal with day in and day out, where they're answering calls, back to back in the inner city or a rural setting, where they're the only officer out there with no backup, and they're being attacked by multiple assailants. Look at that. That's what you need to see. Not what.
Also, like when you get a call, right? You do not know who they are, who's behind the call.
Right.
You do not know what's behind the call. So, and when you're a rookie officer, a lot of the rookie officers I know, you don't say anything. So a lot of those rookie officers that were actually at that scene, they didn't do anything, and people don't understand why. And I'll tell you why. When you start a job, any job, are you going to tell your supervisor or somebody that has been working for the company for 10, 15, 20 years what to do or what not to do, and you just started your first couple of weeks? No, you just keep your mouth shut and you just stand there and do whatever. But actually, they're being condemned also. So I actually feel bad for those other officers that were involved because, yeah, they say they stood by, but they had a week or two on the job. Like, they had no clue what they were doing. Or, I know for myself, you don't tell, a person with time on the job what they're doing correctly or incorrectly. You just, stand there, do your job. And they weren't really even paying attention, I don't think. So what do you feel about that? When you were a new officer, did you correct, a senior officer?
It's a difficult situation that they were placed in. And I think that they shouldn't be painted with a broad brush. Obviously, the investigation will reveal, what eventually will become of it. But it was a terrible situation that they were in. They were dealing with an individual that was fighting them, and I wasn't there. I just saw bits and pieces of the video, and what that one officer was doing to Mr. Floyd did not look good. But, I don't know the totality of the circumstances, so I don't want to second guess the other officers that were assisting Officer Chauvin on what was happening. So once the investigation is completed, I'm sure that all that will be, flushed out. But what I'm saying is, in the law enforcement profession, not everyone should be painted with a broad brush and vilified for what a particular individual did in any circumstance.
Right.
Whether it was, Minneapolis or any other location.
My issue is the media, right? So the media says this officer killed this innocent guy that was unarmed. So do you think you could be killed in other ways besides a gun? Of course. There's so many other ways to kill somebody and to struggle. So, why does the media do this? And then they cause this whole problem because people say, oh my goodness, this officer killed this poor guy for sleeping and he was unarmed. That's what the media says. So if I'm ignorant, right, where most of them are that believe that, they say, oh my God, they killed this innocent black guy because he was sleeping. He didn't do anything wrong. They didn't even tell the rest of the story. It's amazing. How does the media get away with this?
That's because, the mainstream media wants to sensationalize a situation, like with the Atlanta incident.
Right.
What occurred there, the officers did their job, and, the individual was non-compliant. And as far as I'm concerned, that situation was a textbook incident. And once it gets flushed out in the courts, and the officers will be eventually cleared, it'll show that they did the right thing in the Atlanta incident. And that's something that, the American public should be, when they're looking at a news channel, they should be looking at the totality of the circumstances, not just what they're trying to feed you or what the narrative may be, something that could sensationalize their story so that they could have more viewership. And that's an important aspect of when folks are looking at specific incidents. They need to be looking at it from the totality of the circumstances.
Thank you. So with the police reform, we could wrap this up. With the police reform, what do you think the outcome should be, and what do you think the people want? And besides police reform, because that's ridiculous. Defunding the police, that's ridiculous. So reform in what way would be acceptable?
Well, in some of the reform that they're advocating, bringing in mental health professionals, and that's important because the majority of law enforcement officers in this country are not trained mental health professionals, and they're pushed out into this. The folks that need mental health are pushed out into society, and then there's no programs for them, and then these officers have to deal with them. And when the officers arrive in a scene of someone that may have a knife or a gun, or if they're not, if they're not like the average, criminal, they're going to have to deal with the situation. They don't know the circumstances behind what that person is doing. So that's something that they need to deal with. So the executive order and some of the legislation that's being pushed forward, they are dealing with this stuff. So that's something that the mental health professional or the mental health community could help out, or the folks that are advocating for social programs. But to defund the police, that's total nonsense. We're totally against it, and it's a ridiculous narrative that's being pushed across our country.
Correct. Well, thank you. I just feel like how else, you could kill an officer, you could kill anyone without a gun. You could kill them with a bat, you could kill them with a knife, you could kill them with a rock, you could kill them so many different ways, right? Knock them down, they could crack their head open and die. So, you have to watch yourself. And thank you, for sharing your insight, and thank you for all you do for law enforcement. I appreciate it. And I know, we're going to do a lot more together and help out, the citizens of the United States and help them out with this trying time after COVID. Now it's protest. Let's get back to normal and just live our lives, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Val, for having me on. I appreciate all your efforts on behalf of the law enforcement community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you. We'll be back with more questions on a later date. Be safe and God bless.